Wow, I did not think that we would be celebrating another Pesach like this when we had our first Divrei Chizuk for Pesach, words of inspiration on Pesach, which was last year. But I actually really enjoyed last year. I don't know if you remember what we did, but we went over different stories in Jewish history, episodes in Jewish history where Pesach was either canceled or deferred for one reason or another. No, and it had happened before in Jewish history, and I think that idea kept us hopeful. And I hope it keeps us hopeful again this year that Jewish history has periods where everything is good and happy and prosperous. And there are times too that are more difficult. And you know what? We're still here. Someone said a great metaphor to me today. Here's your first Passover lesson. Okay, instead of 5, let's do 6. Here's lesson number 1. The Jewish people are the reason we have an egg on the Seder plate. Why? Because an egg has a unique characteristic. The longer you boil it, the harder it gets. And that's a Jewish trait that we try and emulate. That's why that egg is there on our Seder plate. That's the Jewish people. Corona can try and beat us up, but the harder it tries to boil us, doesn't matter. We have a shell on the outside. We're strong, and it'll just make us tougher when the next opportunity comes around where we need to be tough. The first lesson that I want to share with you so the second lesson that I want to share with you this morning after the lesson of the hard-boiled egg goes right to the beginning of the Haggadah that I thought would be appropriate again as we are again celebrating Pesach, many of us alone. And that's the lesson of why we wash our hands very early on in the evening with the part of the Seder that we call Urchatz. Most people have no clue why we do Urchatz. I used to hear the answer, the reason why we do Urchatz, that is that we wash our hands, that the leader of the Seder washes his hands or her hands before eating of the dipped vegetable, is because we want to elicit questions from people. We want to make the meal a little different and signal right at the beginning that this is a different kind of night.
What do we dip in?
Well,
Salt
that's
water?
I just want to make sure everybody's on mute, Gail. I promise later you'll have a chance to unmute when we get to questions. We're dipping the vegetable in the salt water, but beforehand we wash our hands in the Urchatz part of the Seder. So why is that done? And I found a beautiful interpretation that I wanted to share with you as our second lesson tonight. Allow me to share my screen. This is from a commentary called Darchei Moshe. It's the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the famous Ashkenazi decisor of Jewish law. If you read on your screens what he says, why he's answering the question, why is it that we wash our hands at the beginning of the Seder in that step called Urchatz? He says it is possible to say that reciting the Haggadah is like praying because we are honoring and praising God, and therefore you have to wash your hands. His explanation, I think, fits where we are right now again this year in terms of how we view our Seder tables and our Jewish lives in general. Thankfully, there's live streaming and there's Zoom, and that's enabled us to bring prayer and bring Judaism into our homes. And what the Ramah is saying is actually the Seder night, which is supposed to be celebrated at home, is like a prayer service. The Haggadah is like your Siddur. And some of you may know that there's an established custom that before you go to synagogue, you make sure your hands especially are clean because you're going to be praying to God. This is taken from a famous verse that we actually, in the last weeks that the synagogue was open before the pandemic, we posted this verse everywhere. Who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? Neki chapayim, the one who has clean hands. I think the psalmist was speaking in metaphors. We were speaking literally, and the Ramah also is speaking literally. And I think it's a good way to remind people right at the beginning of the Seder that we're washing our hands because this is prayer. This is our shul. Even if we're in separate houses, we're all connected on Passover night to each other, experiencing, reenacting a prayer experience from our dining rooms. And that's why we wash our hands. I thought it was beautiful and very appropriate for this year. Now, lesson number 3. What is the essence of Passover? Let's just jump right into it. If you think about what changes with the holiday of Passover, the first and maybe the most important thing the Bible tells us about the festival of Passover changing the reality for our ancestors is that it changed their calendar. We tend to forget that because we associate the calendar changing with Rosh Hashanah, a whole new year changing. But the first explicit commandment in the Torah is to change the calendar. This is God's first explicit commandments in the 12th chapter of Exodus. Change the calendar. No longer shall the first month be Tishrei. For 2,500 years, the first month was Tishrei. We're going to have a new first month of the calendar, and that will be Nisan. The implication of the Exodus from Egypt changes the Jewish calendar. Now, why does that happen? No other Jewish holiday had that effect to change the calendar. And one would expect that we should be observing the first month where most of us think the first month is, which is the month of Tishrei, the creation of the world, right? That's what Tishrei, usually when somebody celebrates their birthday on the day they were born. So the world should celebrate its birthday on the day that it came into being. But Passover changes everything. The other question that we could ask on this is, well, if God is going to pick a New Year's Day and tell us to observe it, why pick the first day of Nisan? Why not pick the 15th day of Nisan, the night of Passover, which is the night the event actually took place from the Exodus from Egypt? So I lay out these questions for you because I think they lay out the root of what might be the most essential story of Passover. What is at the root of this holiday's observance, and what I think its central message is that is meant to carry us forward throughout the year. A holiday like this changed the reality. It changed metaphysically our whole relationship with the world and even the way God saw the world. If you look at the verses on your screen, you can see the first verse over here. I'm going to highlight it for you. From Exodus, this month, the month of Nisan, is the first of all the months of the year. The only thing special we know that happened explicitly in the Torah on the first day of Nisan is this. Vayehi b'chodesh harishon b'shana hashenit be'echad lachodesh hukam hamishkan. It came to pass in the first month in the second year, on the first day of the month, that the tabernacle was reared up. The first day of Nisan, which we celebrated about a week ago, the historical event that happened on that day, which changed the calendar for all time, the only one the Torah tells us about is that the sanctuary in the desert was established, inaugurated, one might say. What is it about that event that was so profound that it motivated us to change the calendar? I think we find the following explanation to be to be quite profound. In the Midrash, it says, said Rabbi Shmuel Bar Ami, from the time when the universe was created, God desired to find partners in the world. This is a really, really important Jewish concept. If you've got to memorize a few key verses, key ideas in Judaism, this would be one of the ideas that I would memorize. From the moment God created the world, it wasn't just that Adam was lonely. It was God who was lonely. He looked at the world and said, what am I going to do now? I need people. I need partners who can help me bring forward my vision for humanity and make it real in the world. God needed partners. And this gets hinted at in the following way. This is a famous verse that you all know. Vayihi erev, vayihi boker, yom echad. And it was evening, that should say, and it was evening and it was morning, day one. In all the subsequent days, as you can see in the following quote, it does not say day 2, day 3, day 4. It says the second day, Yom Sheni, the third day, Yom Shlishi. How do you say in Hebrew the first day? It's not Yom Echad. In Hebrew, it would be Yom Rishon. Our rabbis pick up on that. Anyone know the song, One is the loneliest number? And say, maybe the reason why on the first day of creation, God calls the day of one is to signify God's aloneness, his desire to bring forth into the world those partners that the Midrash said he so desired. So where are God's partners? This is fascinating. In the book of Bamidbar, when the sanctuary is established, when is it established? On the first day of the month of Nisan. Vayehi hamakriv bayom harishon. You see that? Let me highlight it here. Our missing first day, Yom Harishon. Who presented their offering on the first day of the month of Nisan, on the day the sanctuary was established? Nachshon, the son of Aminadav, of the tribe of Judah. I think what the Torah is hinting at subliminally is that until the sanctuary was established on the first day of the month of Nisan, God yearned for a partner. And it was not until the sanctuary was established, after the people had left Egypt, it had taken a year after they left, until that sanctuary was established, God was alone. And then came the first offering, and God suddenly found himself with the partners that he so desired. It is really interesting also that the guy who brings that first offering, the one who almost makes the partnership with God, the one who creates that partnership, is a man that we know well, Nachshon ben Aminadav. The famous story with Nachshon ben Aminadav is that he walked into the river, into the sea, when it was not splitting, until it had gotten unto his nose, and then the sea split. Nachshon was the first one to go forward into the sea with faith and say, I believe that God is looking out for us and he will save us. So the one who said, I trust that my partner above is looking out for his partners below, is the one who is honored with inaugurating the sanctuary in the desert on the first day of the month of Nisan, the day where I think creation gets fixed. God's loneliness, which we were stuck celebrating from the moment the world was created on the first day of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, once the partnership happens, the calendar changes. Now, the greatest day of the year is not the birthday of the world, but one could say the anniversary of God's marriage to the Jewish people. When God found his partners, that anniversary day became the month that determined the whole course of the Jewish calendar. And it was the first day of Nisan, the day that the sanctuary was established, which is called Yom HaRishon, the missing first day that never appeared in the story of creation. Now, where am I going with this? That this story is actually hinted at in your Haggadah. If you're using a traditional Haggadah, you will get to this section. Yachol mirosh chodesh, vehigadita levincha, yachol mirosh chodesh. This is a question that the Haggadah asks. Why don't we start telling the story of Passover from the day of Rosh Chodesh Nisan? Now, we think to ourselves, what a stupid question. The night of the Exodus is obviously the night you're supposed to be telling the story of Passover. But it was not so obvious to the rabbis, perhaps because they, like I'm submitting, understood that the first day of Nisan had just as powerful a message as the 15th day of Nisan, the day when the Exodus actually happened. And if you read the rest of this midrash, you'll see that the answer is you have to tell the story with props. You have to tell the story with matzah umaror, and the night you have matzah maror in front of you is the 15th day of Nisan, not the first day of Nisan. So you have to wait. But what's interesting is the rabbis are entertaining the idea that the first day of Nisan might be where this all begins. And I think, by the way, there's another story related to the first day of Nisan. And that is that our ancestors took the lamb for the Passover sacrifice, the first Passover sacrifice, which they sacrificed on the night of Passover. When did they take that lamb from the Egyptians? They didn't have lambs themselves. They stole it from them. A lot of sources, the Torah doesn't say it, but sources say it happened on the first day of Nisan. So that night, when the Jewish people finally believed in themselves and believed in God, such that they could say, we're partners here. God hasn't abandoned us. And if we take these lambs, I think we'll be okay. I think God will look out for us. And if we step in the water, I think we'll be okay. I think that God will look out for us. Just like when a year later we say, I think if we build this sanctuary, if we build this Mishkan, God will dwell in our midst. And that's exactly what happens. So we all know there are dates on the calendar that if we don't, that are dates that mark the passage of time. Anniversaries, birthdays, holidays. So we're learning here that in the month of Nisan, there is an important anniversary that I think is meant to change all of time, the way the Jewish people count time. Our entire year starts not by celebrating the birthday of the world, but the anniversary of us becoming partners with God in making the world a better place. And that begins on the first day of Nisan. That is, in many ways, the story of Passover, a group of slaves who say, this is not the way things are supposed to be. This is not the way God created the world, that human beings should just be tools in economic structures. We deserve freedom. We deserve rest. We deserve independence. We deserve a destination. We deserve rights. That's the beginning. All of Jewish time starts from that one point. Let me move on to my next lesson. Now, this is the one that I said I have to share with you because I heard it on a podcast this morning with the author of a brand new book on the Passover Seder named Mark Gerson. Mark Gerson, if you've heard of Hatzalah, not Hatzolah, Hatzalah. These are the scooters in Israel that go around and go to first aid scenes, crashes, and people who have medical troubles. Mark Gerson founded Hatzalah. It's called United Hatzalah of Israel, I think. He also has a very famous podcast called The Rabbi's Husband, because his wife is a reform rabbi. He's a very successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, and he wrote a book that just got released a couple of weeks ago called The Telling: How Judaism's Essential Book Reveals the Meaning of Life. What essential book is he talking about? Not the Torah. He's talking about Haggadah Shel Pesach. It is an entire book on how the Haggadah is the best book or most important book in Judaism. He calls it a condensed version of the Torah. And when we speak about Passover, signifying the passage of time, delineating when Jewish time starts, I thought it would be nice to share a novel interpretation of his on the meaning of matzah that he says is for him as clear as day. Let's read what he has to say in his new book. And if you like it, you can go on Amazon and buy a copy. I don't think you'll get it for this Pesach, but you can get it for next one. When a significant amount of salt is added to yeast, the yeast doesn't rise, and the result is the flat, cracker-like bread known as matzah. What Gerson says is, in order to understand the meaning of matzah, you have to understand the meaning of salt. Now, that is strange. It's strange and interesting. It's strange because what is salt? At what point in the Haggadah does one of the four children ask, why do we have salt on the table? It doesn't appear anywhere in the Seder, except some of you know the custom to dip in salt water. If you go to, there's some grocery stores, kosher grocery stores in New York that are selling a bottle of salt water, if you'd like, kosher for Passover for $4.99. If you really are careful about kashrut on Passover, you can get it shipped, I'm sure, for for an affordable price. Salt, he says, is the opposite of yeast. Now, I had to ask Carmela this because Carmela bakes challah, and she agrees. If you add too much salt to the yeast doesn't rise. The yeast doesn't work. There has to be the right balance between yeast and salt. Salt and yeast are opposites. They're also opposites because yeast makes things go bad. We know this about bread. I'm from Montreal, and the biggest criticism about our bagels in Montreal is they go bad after a day, right? That's what yeast does to food. It allows the flour to ferment, and by fermenting, it makes it go bad very quickly. Nobody would ever dream of buying a Montreal bagel that's a week old. But matzah, on the other hand, which is made without any yeast, who knows when your matzah was made? It could have been made months and months ago. And so Gerson posits that salt is the opposite of yeast. Salt makes things stay. It preserves. Before the era of refrigerators, salt was what was used to preserve foods. Yeast does the opposite. It makes food go bad faster. This dichotomy for Gerson is also at the heart of Passover. Why is it that we get rid of things in our house that go bad quickly? That is chametz, stuff that goes bad quickly, because some things in life ought to be temporary. Maybe it's a bad character trait. Maybe it's where we find ourselves in a particular relationship and it's time to make up and renew. Some fight that you're having with somebody, who knows? Some things are in our lives are like yeast. They ought to be gotten rid of and disposed of with the passing of time. But other things need salt. Other things need to be preserved. So what is the meaning of having salt water on the Pesach table and no chametz? Well, Passover is a night to preserve a story, to keep a tradition alive and fresh and kept so that it can be passed down to future generations. Salt is actually more present at the Seder table than you think. It's just hidden. What foods do Jews eat that don't have salt in them? Everything, right? Salt is all over the place at the table. And it reminds us that Passover is about asking, what do we keep? What do we put away? Isn't that what we're supposed to do on any new year? You've all heard about New Year's resolutions, and on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, this is what we talk about. What do we want to change? What do we want to keep? Well, if, as I just posited, the Torah says the real New Year is now going to be Nisan, because this is when it all started, God's partnership with us. Well, doesn't it make sense that the Torah then says, and during that month, you're going to clean both physically and spiritually. Get rid of everything that needs to be temporary. In other words, everything that needs to expire in life that's past its expiration date, and keep that which needs to stick around. That's matzah. Matzah is holy on Passover, not because, according to Gerson, we didn't have time and the bread didn't have time to rise. He says that's not what it's about. It's because matzah lasts. On the night before Passover, Jews purge their homes of bread and introduce the matzah in its place. It is an opportunity to ask, what in my life do I want to discard? What do I want to preserve? And what do I want to last forever, even after I am gone? If you like that idea, there's a whole bunch more of interesting ideas that he brings forward in his book, and you can write it down if you'd like to buy a copy and read it over. It really is wonderful. And if you'd like to listen to him on his podcast, I think the podcast is produced by the Tikva Fund. The Tikva Fund, which is a major Jewish philanthropic fund in the States They have a podcast every week, and I enjoy listening to it. And Mark Gerson was just interviewed last week about this book, and it's wonderful. Something else that he says, by the way, why the cup of Elijah? Because no Jewish story can end. No good Jewish story has an ending. We like to keep the fifth cup of Elijah to say, maybe the story will go this way, maybe the story will go that way. There's no definite conclusion. Remember that the whole idea of Elijah's cup is we're not sure if there should be a fifth cup of wine or not. So we put it out there and let Elijah make up his mind. For Gerson, he says, the Passover Seder must never be wrapped up and concluded, such that all the answers will be provided to all the questions. Just like in the Torah, the Jewish people always they're still wandering in the desert, even as the Torah concludes. Good Jewish stories don't end. They keep going and going and going. Just a couple of beautiful ideas in his book. Okay, lesson number 5. This, I think, is a special help for those who are telling the story with the traditional Haggadah. One of the things that I noticed a couple of years ago at Beth Tikva, we wanted to do a Seder for only for converts. There was a special fund, and many conversion students don't have anywhere to go for Passover. So there was a special fund available to help, let's say, make converts to Judaism feel more embraced and welcome. So we applied for a grant, Rabbi Sachs and I, and we received it to put on a Passover Seder specifically for converts to Judaism, and was a big success. And we went to go look for the right Haggadah. We said, we got to get something interesting because it's the first real Seder. Let's get a good Haggadah. And to be honest with you, it was very, very hard to find a traditional Haggadah that was interesting. What we found at the bookstore was there are many Haggadot that have moved far away from the traditional text of the Haggadah. And those are actually the interesting good ones. There's always new Haggadot, but they leave out important sections. They skip over some stuff. And then when we looked at the traditional Haggadot, most of them had no commentary or way too much commentary and not enough pictures and drawings and fun stuff in them to make the Seder interesting. We ended up settling on Noam Sion's Haggadah, which is fantastic. I think it's called A Different Night. But it was very hard to find the space between. And I think the reason is because many of us do not understand how the traditional Haggadah fulfills the requirement of telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt. We look at it it's stories about people who wake up early in the morning to say the Shema and different proverbs and sayings, and we ask ourselves, what does this have to do with the story of the Exodus from Egypt? Are we actually fulfilling the requirement here to tell the story? This doesn't sound like the story. So I wanted to help you out for those who are still using the traditional text of the Haggadah. I thought I would break it all down for you, how the Magid section of the Haggadah works, so that you can follow along and actually see that there's a sequence here in how Magid tells the story of Passover. I'll send this to you. If anybody would like a copy, just send me an email and I can send this to you. If you're using a traditional Haggadah, I think this is a big help. Magid, the section in which we tell the story, has two major sections. The first is a section of how to tell the story of the Exodus. The second is what to tell as part of the story. Confusing these two parts is what makes the Haggadah seems like a hodgepodge. But when we understand that they're actually two separate sections, it starts to make sense. The first part of the night is to tell how we are supposed to tell the story before we actually tell the story. And only in the second part do we tell the story. So let's review. How do we tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt? It's hard to jump into the Haggadah without knowing this rule that is found in the Mishnah, but is not found in the Haggadah. This is the rule. According to the intellect of the son, the father instructs him. He begins with shame and concludes with praise. So the Mishnah says, here's one of the rules, how you tell the story. You have to start with shamefulness and then praise for God. So why do we begin telling the story with Avadim Hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim, Avadim Hayinu, in order to fulfill the commandment of beginning the story in slavery, right? So some people, when they tell the story further back or try and explain other things before they get there to this part, they're not fulfilling how the Mishnah says you have to tell the story. So that's why Avadim Hayinu begins. The next rule for telling the story of the Exodus is about quantity. So first we learn where we start and where we end, and then quantity. What's the rule with quantity? Many of you know this. Kol hamarbel esaper b'tziat Mitzrayim harei ze meshubach. The more one tells the story, the better. We announced this rule with the story of the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, right? Now it makes sense. Why are we reading a story about rabbis who go on and on and on? To learn how we're supposed to tell the story, which is to elaborate on it and discuss it as long as possible. The next rule for telling the story of the Exodus is timing. When do we tell the story? The answer is, it must be told at night. We announced this rule with the part about Elazar ben Azariah. You'll see that in the Haggadah when it says, we actually just reviewed it above. I bayom yachol mi be'od yom. Shouldn't we tell this story during the day that the Exodus happened? Nope, you have to tell it at night. So that's mentioned in the Haggadah, Ve'higada talabincha, and it's explaining to us that this story has to be told in a particular way, in a particular quantity, and at a particular time. The next rule for telling the story of the Exodus concerns one's audience. The story must be told in a different way for different people. We announced this rule with the allegory of the 4 children. Keneged arba banim dibra Torah, the wise, the simple, the rasha, the evil one, and the one who is unable to ask. Know your audience. That's one of the rules of telling the story. So why do we read that story? Because we're still learning about the qualifications, even before we get to telling the story from the beginning. And the next rule is about props. We announced this rule with the paragraph Yachol Mirosh Chodesh. We saw that above, which concludes with the statement that the story must be told with matzah and maror physically present. So when you read all those midrashim that everyone just breezes through, that are overly familiar to us, maybe this year explain to everybody what those are there for. These are preambles. This is what Jews are like. Before we do something, first we're going to learn how to do it properly. And that's what these rules are. That's what these rules are meant to help us out with. Only then do we start telling the story of the Exodus? Number one, we tell the story of the Exodus beginning with our ancestors were idolaters, and tell some of our people's history. Mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu. In the beginning, our ancestors worshipped idols. That's how we begin telling the story. Then we continue with the first fruits declaration, which contains a concise retelling of the Exodus. Anyone know how that one begins? Arami Oved Avi. It's good we're reviewing this. By the time you get to the Seder night and you have a traditional Haggadah open in front of you, you'll know what this is about. Oh, that's the first fruits declaration that the Bible says our ancestors used to pronounce when they brought their first fruits to the temple. And in that little declaration is a concise history of the Jewish people. We came from misery and God took us out of there, period. And we fulfill the obligation of telling the story by reciting the same declaration that our ancestors did when they brought those first fruits to the temple. God brought us out of both spiritual and physical degradation into freedom. We continue with a series of ancient midrashim about the story of the Exodus. So in the next section of the Haggadah, we're talking about what exactly happened on the night. How did it look? And then the plagues and Dayenu. Then back to the rules for telling the story of the Exodus. We finish Magid with 2 additional rules on how to tell the story. Number 1, we have to mention Pesach, Matzah, Umaror when we tell the story. So we refer that rule and make sure that it's followed in front of everybody. And number 2, Bechol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa b'Mitzrayim. We need to make sure that we're telling this story as if it actually happened to us. We then praise God with the Hallel, which means not only did we begin the story in degradation, but we fulfilled the second rule in the Mishnah. We ended it with praise. And of course, then we eat. But for those of us who are confused about how the story is told, I thought this would be helpful to have next to us when we're telling Magid. There's actually a method to the madness. There's a sequence to the whole order, and that's why the story is told in that particular way. And maybe this can help you to appreciate how the Haggadah goes about telling its story. Okay. The last lesson that I wanted to share with you, inspiration for Passover and for the Pesach night, begins, I guess, with a question. Why is it that only for Passover we have this law that you see on the screen? Let's read it. This is from Maimonides. This is the commandment to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt on the evening of the 15th of Nisan at the beginning of the evening, and according to the telling abilities of the storyteller. There is no commandment on Hanukkah to tell the story of Hanukkah. There is no commandment on Rosh Hashanah to tell the story of Rosh Hashanah, or Sukkot, or Shavuot. Now you can say, but hold on, when we come to synagogue, we're reading the Torah readings that relate to those celebrations. Fine, but there's no commandment that says, in order to fulfill the obligations of that holiday, you have to tell the story. Such a commandment only exists on Passover. And by the way, it's very interesting what Maimonides says, according to the telling abilities of the storyteller. Kefi tzechot lashon hamisaper. You need to do it in your way. If you're a person who likes to tell the story in a who knows, in a jovial way, in a more reserved way. Don't say that you can't because you're not good enough. As long as you're telling the story, and I think this is an experience a lot of us went through last year, and maybe this year we're going to go through it again too. A lot of people who have to do the Seder the first time, they say, I don't know how to do this. My Zeta usually does it. My father usually does it. My Savta usually does it. My aunt usually does it. Don't worry. Maimonides said, you do it to the best of your abilities, according to the abilities of the storyteller, and you're okay. I think there's a nice thing there that Maimonides has. There's a very human aspect to this rule. And all those who elaborate on the story and emphasize what God did for us and how the Egyptians dealt with us and how God avenged the Egyptians and praise God for his goodness, it is even better. As they say, those who expound upon the story of the Exodus are to be are to be praised. So my question is, why specifically on Passover are we obligated to tell the story of the holiday, unlike all other Jewish holidays? Maybe except for Purim. Maybe Purim you have to read the Megillah, but except for Purim, on any other holiday, you don't have to read about what happened on that day. So I'm going to provide two answers for you. The first one is sort of obvious, the second one less so. The first answer is, you cannot understand anything about Judaism unless you understand the story of the Exodus from Egypt. When Mark Gerson says in his book, in the cover of his book that I'm promoting without getting any fee, unfortunately, that I'm promoting tonight, how Judaism's essential book reveals the meaning of life, and he's talking about the Haggadah, what he's basically saying is the story of the Exodus from Egypt is the most important book and story we have in Judaism. And folks, we know that. Every Friday night, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim is all over the place in Judaism. In the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, left and right, always remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and therefore don't oppress the stranger. All of the laws, all of our practices, all of our history has this grounding in God partnered with us. I'm using that language purposefully because of what we just learned above. On that holiday, God and the Jewish people became one. And we said, we're committed to living as a people with God's laws, with a mission. And our mission comes from our history, that once upon a time, we were just tools for other people to exploit. And we will always keep that first and foremost in our consciousness. It will serve as the foundation for our whole religious view on the world. Everything we are, everything we believe, stems from the story of the Exodus from Egypt. I can prove that point to you not only by just showing you how often that phrase, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, we do this in remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, appears in Judaism, but also by showing you the way the remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt is highlighted in Deuteronomy when Moses is talking about Passover. In this verse, chapter 16, when we're presented with the observance of the holidays, including Passover, the verse says, remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live. Kol yemei chayecha. So at first glance, it looks like the Bible is commanding us never to forget the Exodus from Egypt. But the Mishnah actually says it's more than that. It's actually even more than never forget it. If you look here, this is a section we're familiar with because it appears in the Haggadah. Ben Zoma says, you may remember the day you went out of Egypt all the days of your life. The days of your life refers to daytime alone. However, the addition of the word all, as it says all the days of your life, comes to add nights as well. So according to Ben Zoma, when the Torah says, remember the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life, it's not saying just remember it and don't forget it. It's saying you actually need to mention the Exodus from Egypt every day and mention the Exodus from Egypt every night. That's how important this story is to the Jew. And by the way, that is exactly what we do. We mention the Exodus every morning and every night in the Shema. When we recite the Shema, we thank God for redeeming us from Egypt, and the Shema must be recited once in the morning and once in the evening. The rabbis who posit there is no obligation to mention the Exodus from Egypt at night explain the world differently and say, the days of your life refers to the days in this world. All is added to include the days of the Messiah. What's actually going on here in this debate in the Mishnah is the rabbis are saying, this story is so important. Let me show you how important it is. And one says it's so important, not only can you not forget it, you have to mention it every day. Oh yeah, Ben Zoma says, not only do you have to mention it every day, you have to mention it every night. And then the rabbis come in and say, oh yeah, I'll tell you it's even more important than both of you think. Not only do you have to mention it every day, not only do you have to mention it every night, you must continue mentioning the story of the Exodus from Egypt after the Messiah comes. There's an idea in Judaism that after the Messiah comes, we won't need any of the holidays anymore. Not according to this passage. Pesach will still be around. We will still need to remember the story of the Exodus. Because without it, Judaism loses all meaning, all sense. There's no grounding. There is no feeling. There's no emotion. There's no antidote. There's no collective memory. A great U.S. congressman who died this year said the movement without storytelling is like birds without wings. I thought of those words when I read this passage. Congressman John Lewis. What movement was he talking about? He's talking about the movement for civil rights. The civil rights movement without a story is like a bird without wings. So let me borrow his language. Judaism without the Exodus from Egypt is like a bird without wings. But there is a second reason that we are obligated, I think, to tell the story of the Exodus on Passover, but we are not obligated to tell the story of the other holidays on those holidays. And that is found in what Maimonides has to say in the laws of telling the story. In every generation, one must show himself as if he personally had come out from the subjugation of Egypt. As it is stated, and he took us out of there, took us, the emphasis there is us, he took us out of there, not our ancestors, us. And regarding this, the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded in the Torah, remember that you were a slave, meaning to say, as if you yourself had been a slave, came out of freedom and redeemed, and were redeemed. Bechol dor vador chayav adam leharot et atzmo. In every generation, when one tells the story, we need to show that we are free. I think the second reason to explain why we are commanded to tell the story of Passover on Passover is because telling stories is an act of freedom. If you read here the second quote that I provided from Virginia Hamilton, also talking about the African American experience, she says, storytelling was the first opportunity for Black folks to represent themselves as anything other than property. What I think, by the way, it's so fascinating to see how the story of the Exodus resonates in the story of civil rights in the United States. I mentioned Congressman Lewis and Virginia Hamilton too, because they're in recent memory explaining to us what the power of storytelling really is. And I think you're seeing today, by the way, a revival of African American storytelling, a sense of pride. When white people were telling the stories of African Americans, their story was told in a distorted way, in a way that made them feel degraded and subjugated and the property of other people. But when they could start telling their own stories, suddenly you see beauty and you see humanity and you see spiritual freedom. Why is it that Jews tell the story of Passover? Why we're obligated to tell the story? Because on that night, where we must show ourselves to be free, the greatest act of freedom that we could do is tell our story. Not let anybody else tell it, but claim it as our own. Proclaim our humanity, proclaim our faith, proclaim our worth, own our heritage. That's freedom. That's freedom. Amar Shmuel, lechem oni ktiv, lechem she'onin alav dvarim. What is matzah, which is called lechem oni? Oni from the word la'anot, to answer things. That bread is there. The whole point of the matzah being there, some people would say, oh, it's a matzah is there to remind us that we left Egypt in a hurry. No, Mark Gerson says, no, matzah is there to remind us that some things need to be preserved. No, it's not that. According to this passage in the Talmud, the reason the matzah is there is to remind us to tell our story. Lechem she'onin alav dvarim. Don't leave anything on that table, and especially the matzah, without a context, without taking ownership out of it. And so I'm going to conclude there and conclude maybe with just the following thought. This Passover, we have more than the usual stories to tell. Unfortunately, this has been a year where we're full of stories of suffering and degradation, maybe, and separation and loneliness. I mean, I could go on how difficult a year this has been. The worst thing a person can do with bad experiences, ask any therapist, is keep them inside you, like chametz, to fester and rot and never get them away. The Seder table is a place actually where you have your family around you, your friends around you, even if it's on a screen, to talk about what you've been through in the past year. Get that story out of you. Own what this year has been like. Tell us what you've seen as the most challenging part of this pandemic. What lessons you learned in the pandemic. What are the times where you really saw hope, where you saw acts of kindness that you never would have expected to see in such a difficult time? If storytelling can be a redemption for enslavement from Egypt, I believe that storytelling can also be a redemption from a pandemic, a redemption from any difficult time that we go through in life. Don't miss the opportunity this year to make your Seders a little bit different. We've been through a very difficult year, as I said. And if there's any year where we should be able to ask ourselves, well, what's the salt and where's the chametz? What do I want to keep with me from this year? And what do I want to throw away as the world hopefully becomes better, as the situation in the world becomes better? If there's any year where that question is important, it's this year. And that's what I'm going to do with my Seders. And I'd invite you to do the same. Even with my kids, kids have had a terrible, terrible time. If there's any year, you should be able to engage your kids about what it's been like to be in their Egypt, their version of Egypt, which I call homeschool. Actually, it's our version of slavery for parents. That's what homeschool is. But for children, it's imprisonment, right? Most children. Bring it out this year. Tell us what it was like going through that difficult experience. Own your story. Tell your story. What were the things that helped you stay balanced? What were the things that kept you hopeful? What do you hope for in the new year? That's what freedom is. Freedom is people telling their stories and not and having that story come from honest and deep reflection, not media spin, but honest and deep reflection about what this year has been like. It's a time to process. And so I think it goes back to the first thing that I wanted to say to you, which is there's something special going around our Seder tables. So much so that the Ramah said, you wash your hands before you get there, because that's how holy that Seder table is. It's like a Beit Knesset. It's like you're walking into synagogue where you sit around that table. So you wash your hands. You're getting ready to celebrate the real creation of the world. And in a way, to set yourself free from whatever Mitzrayim, whatever Egypt you still find yourself in. And in that way, you really be able to say that I have lived Maimonides' rule. I see myself as having lived through the experience of our ancestors who were redeemed from Egypt. The end. I will stop there. So I'm now going to go to the chat box. And as I promised earlier, pick out questions that I want to answer and ignore the ones that I don't know the answers to. And you're free, if you'd like, to ask any other questions you'd like in the chat box. And I'll allow anyone, if they would like, to unmute. Just let me take a look quickly at some of the questions. Mel says, should we wash hands at shul before entering for any service, even not Pesach? Yes, you should. That's one of the rules of prayer. Before you walk into a synagogue, you're supposed to wash your hands. Murray says, we wash our hands because Dr. Fauci orders us to do it. Will we be able to get a copy of your source sheet? Yes, anybody who would like a copy of the source sheet, please feel free to email me, jrgrover@gmail.com. I'd be happy to send it to you. And actually, what I do in my class...
It's feeding back.
Because it's unmuted.
What I do in my class is I give a link so you can download it right now.
Oh, good. There's a very strong echo, Rabbi.
Yeah, sorry. Sometimes it doesn't work. So I'm going to have to mute everybody. We'll use the hand function instead. If you want to speak, raise your hand, the fake hand there, the cartoon hand, and that will work better so that there's no feedback. So hold on, let me share in the chat box the link to all the notes tonight. There you go. You should all see that link, and if you click on it, you'll be able to download the links for the Seder. So Ruth's the links for the class tonight. Ruth asks, why is the new year in September and not Passover? So in the Mishnah, it says there are 4 new years. There are 4 new years in the Jewish calendar. And Passover, the first day of Nisan, is one of those new years. And also the first day of Tishrei is another one of those new years. I know it's confusing. But the new year at the beginning of Tishrei is the birthday of the world, where the world came into being. And what I wanted to submit to you tonight is that when the world came into being, something was missing. And not until the Mishkan was established, which happened on the first day of Nisan, the day where we said we're going to make a home for God in this world, which I think is as much metaphorical as it is literal. When I say that, I mean our ancestors, yeah, they wanted to build an actual house for God, but we've got to build a house for God too. We've got to make sure the world we live in is a house for God, a world where there's kindness and compassion, where there's no cruelty, a world where there's justice and love. That's the house we build for God. And that happened on the first day of Nisan, where finally a group of people said, God, we're ready to be married. We're ready to work for you. That's who we are, the Jewish people. We're God's partners. God was missing us for 2,500 years. And finally, the first day of Nisan, everything changed. Thank you for some nice compliments here. Wow, I'm humbled by this. Thank you very much. Murray says, have you taken note that the light at the end of the COVID-19 tunnel has occurred this week pre-Pesach? Yes, and it certainly occurred also in Israel. I think they're really getting an experience this year of from slavery to freedom. Yeah, I'm very jealous of their experience. Okay, Rhonda, you have a question. I can ask you to unmute. Rhonda? I'm not able to unmute Rhonda. Okay, if you can figure it out, Rhonda, I'm allowing you to unmute when you get the chance. Does anyone else want to ask a question? You can just raise your cartoon hand if you'd like. But of course, if you have questions that you'd like to ask as you prepare for Pesach, as I said at the beginning of the class, if a rabbi's not available the week before Passover, the rabbi may as well quit. Then you're useless the rest of the year. This is the most important week of the year for the rabbi to check his emails. So please feel free to use your emails, jrgrover@gmail.com, if you'd like to send me a question about what we learned tonight or about anything else that comes up on Passover.